Hello and welcome to the second session of Plato, a reality game in 4 levels. I'm going to pass the mic off to the instructor, Rosemary Desjardins.
Thanks, Theo. Okay, so last session we had a very brief introduction on some of the main ideas of Plato, and we mentioned that among all these ideas, there is one unifying idea that glues everything together in the work of Plato, and that's the idea of the good, which Plato calls the form of forms. Also, we mentioned that Plato's work moves chronologically. Namely, is one of those philosophers who vastly revises his positions from the early period to middle period to transitional period to a later period. And the only idea that is preserved throughout this the chronological course is the idea of the good. The only form that is still reserves its special status as a timeless form is the form of the good. All other forms, justice, knowledge, beauty, so on and so forth, lose their special status as they were basically being treated in Republic. They are no longer, in fact, forms. For example, in Theaetetus, there are categories of thought, or ideal categories of thought, or in Kantian sense, basically transcendental idealities, which can never capture the essence of the true transcendence, which is for Plato the idea of the good, the principle of intelligence. So today we are going, and as I mentioned, everything will be casual. We are not going to go to the scholarly details about the work of Plato, because it's not supposed to be yet another a scholarly lecture on Plato. We are just simply going to casually go through some of main ideas and try to somehow update them and give a kind of an interpretation, a new interpretation of the genuine ideas or genuine thoughts behind them. So today we are going to talk about mostly about a very important part of the Republic, which sets the tone not only for the Republic, as this sprawling dialogue, but also for all of Plato's later works. And this part is represented by the so-called discussion or dialogue on the analogy of the divided line. So before moving to talking about what the divided line is and why it is important and how it captures the idea of the good as a principle of intelligence and what are its implications and how it glues different ideas like logos, dialectics, mathematics, illusions, beliefs, so on and so forth together, which are dominant ideas in Plato's work. Let's hear your ideas, your thoughts about what do you think about the material, that section, the divided line, in connection with the most famous, a stereotypical example of Plato, the allegory of the cave. Theodore, you want to start?
Sure, let me pull up my PDF really quick. Actually, I'd rather not start.
Can I say something?
Sure, absolutely.
I just missed a bit of the class, but what I gather from the divided line is that it's about the indeterminacy of the form of unity, or the unity of form, or the relationship between the two of them, such that a particular thing can only be considered as it is in relation to the form of that thing in general, and to another different particular thing on a specific level. But that thing, the difference between those things, even if they are of the same form as we call them, like if they're both chairs, the difference is always ineluctable and inexplicable and indeterminate. So is that, that's that to me is the way in which I'm understanding the good as a principle that sort of supersedes any logical or potential logical analysis, and thus sort of grounds or provides a foundation for a supposed ideality of sorts. But also,
sure, I will talk about this. I would rather to use not the word indeterminacy, but I would say, as I mentioned, one of the main ideas or series of ideas that Plato borrows from pre-Socratic is a difference between to paras and to apeiron, to determine and to indetermine, to limit and to unlimit. And the significance of idea is that precisely because this very basic principle allows us to separate, but also to combine according to a specific measures, things in the universe, things in cosmos. And also, by way of this process of separation and combination, or what Plato in Theaetetus called composteros, is that we can create mixtures, what in contemporary philosophical lexicon we can call them intelligible unities. Intelligible unities. Now these mixtures, they are in themselves are always indeterminable, but not in the sense that they are indeterminable as such. Their indeterminacy allows you to move further and make them more intelligible, according to, for example, the relation between this chair or that chair, according to the particularities, but also how they fall under the same forms, for example. So this indeterminacy shouldn't be understood as the way that we define today indeterminacy, what you might call to be the divided line, this method of separation and integration in order to create intelligible unities or mictons, mixtures, allows us to think about things in the universe no longer as things of which we have a total knowledge. That's the most important thing. Basically, Plato wants to, and that's the whole idea of the good, creates a principle through which every form of totality in the universe, the totality of beauty, the totality of knowledge, can never be concluded. Hence, it becomes a procedure. And this is the idea of integration, separation and integration, dialectics. Because once the intelligibility of thing is conceived as a matter of totality, meaning that you have said everything that could be said about something, then that thing, according to Plato, becomes an illusion, a shadow, an iconos, an image. So Plato wants to understand intelligibility not as a given thing, but as a process, as an unfolding procedure. And that's the most important thing.
Right. This is exactly what I was saying, but I was saying that it's only the quintessential or ultimate indeterminacy of the good, or this ideal, the divided line, that
the good, you see, yes, I don't think that we can attribute the word indeterminacy to the good, because the good is not a thing to be determined. A good is a principle, that allows us to basically move between the determinate and the indeterminate.
Well, I've been reading Aquinas this week as well, and he says that the good always seeks its own expansion.
Yes, this is exactly what Plato, I mean, this is a very Platonic idea, that intelligence or nous only seeks itself. That's it. Only intelligence is the only thing in the universe that always wants more of itself.
And but that is the principle.
Yes, that is the principle. Yes.
Okay. All right. Hold on. I have to nip to the toilet real quick. Sorry.
Christian, you want to go on?
Sure. Because the question, we're talking about our responses to the divided line, and what there's the what's really interesting to me is the fact of how the third segment, the first would be, correct me if I'm wrong,
iconos.
Sort of like the first is iconos.
Yes, images, shadows.
Yeah, images, and then
the second one is pistis,
which is like that's likenesses, right?
Pistis, what you might call to be the domain of true opinions.
Okay.
Or beliefs.
Okay, and then you've got dianoia and then episteme.
Yes.
Correct. All right, so
basically logoi and then eidos.
Okay. So what to me was really interesting was the whole notion of treating the third as hypotheses, and only with the fourth do you get the grounding of the hypotheses. So what I found so intriguing was the fact that the way that the hypotheses operate is like it's sort of like turf that you can play on, and then only after like working through dialectic and dialogue to carry out the implications of the hypotheses can you finally ground them in the fourth, which is the eidos.
Yes, you see, what you might call to be the third segment is the realm of theory construction. It's not accidental that the objects of the third segment are mathematicos or logoi, because metaphysically, mathematics enables you to structure multiplicity according to mathematical objects, namely formal unities. So it is what you might call, you see, this actually the third segment intermediates between the fourth segment, which is the realm of forms, and the second segment, the realm of objects in nature, and namely the true opinions or matter-of-factual beliefs about multiplicity of things in the universe. So exactly like how mathematics function in physics today, why is that mathematics can gain traction on the universe? Plato thinks it because it has a metaphysical structure, and this metaphysical structure is encapsulated by its intermediary function between unities and multiplicities. Multiplicities of things in nature, physical items, structures, and unities, namely mathematical concepts, mathematical structures, categories.
There's something I wanted to kind of ask, not about the divided line, but about the good in general.
Sure.
Would you say that in some sense it's kind of, I don't know if this might be a little hard to sort of articulate, but it's almost like in order for thought to happen at all, there needs to be like a certain type of affirmation. Like if you ever, I don't mean affirmation in the sense of like being positive, but just in the sense of sort of like a, yes, this works, go forward. Like if you never, if your cognition never sort of, if nothing ever kind of melded, with your cognition in a way that, your cognition said this works, you would never really, the thinking would kind of never get off the ground. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, this is absolutely true. Yes, this is what basically what you might call to be some sort of self-referential process of cognition. That if cognition doesn't recognize itself, it cannot gain traction, and that's absolutely true. And the way that basically divide line, as I will talk about, it's actually quite a strange diagram. Basically, every time, so starting from the first segments, then you go to the second segment. First segment is very rudimentary, fleeting, sensorial, impulses and stimulations. And the second one is a matter of beliefs about or opinions about objects in nature. And then the third one is the realm of mathematics or logoi. And then the third one of forms. Now the thing is that basically it's the diagram implies that every time that you can actually say something, even at the level of fleeting images, shadows, that I can actually recognize things, it implies that there is a principle through which intelligence, as you might say, affirm itself and always posits the reality of that thing from a next level. So this is really, I think, a cryptic thing about Plato, that intelligence, what you might call to be the engineer of reality, by virtue of recognizing the reality of itself. And the way that it basically conceives of reality or perceives reality is that it always moves backward in the diagram. So if you can't really see the shadows in the first level unless you have the B. You can't see you can have true opinions about objects in nature, namely segment B, if you don't have segment C. You can have segment C if you can't have segment D. So it's always comes from one level further. It's like, that's basically the principle of intelligence.
I'm sharing a picture of it right here.
Did you manage to get it?
Oh, I can bring it back.
You might be able to share just one application window.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. It's right here.
It's really cute. It's like a movie. Yeah, and after
And Adam, you can see that basically this is what you might call the self-affirmation or self-recognition of intelligence, which is the idea of the good. You see that it is extremely similar, and it was really influential for Hegel's idea of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness, not in the Kantian sense, but in the Hegelian self-consciousness. This is exactly what self-consciousness is.
Yeah, and there was a interview with Jacques Derrida where he said, you know, I've picked up this mantle of, you know, questioning as kind of the privileged form of philosophy from, you know, from Plato and from Heidegger, and, you know, questioning is fantastic, but, you know, maybe before questioning there's kind of this, even, you know, before questioning there's some sort of cognitive or philosophical affirmation before you even get to the point of asking questions.
Yes. And you see, this is for Plato. Plato implicitly thinks that the function of philosophy belongs not by asking question about cosmos, but it begins with a sense of wonder, not of the universe, but a wonder of thought itself, the possibility of thinking. If thought is possible, then what are the ramifications of it? And only in taking this possibility seriously that we can, in fact, posit questions about the nature of things and the nature of thinking.
And that's kind of always what's really drawn me to philosophy, actually, is just sort of the wonder of thought and its thought's own possibilities.
Excellent.
Not possibilities for other things, but
yes, possibilities for itself. Yes, yes.
Itself. Yeah.
Theo, any input?
Yeah, I'm just sort of, is the good a guarantor of correspondence between the mind and its objects?
I won't say that it's a guarantor in the sense that it guarantees that every time that mind functions, it will yield a true belief about the things in the world. But guarantor in the sense that if it doesn't exist, there would not be any form of cognitive process that can structure of the world. So basically, it's the guarantor of the structuration of the world, how we can structure, how mind can in fact structure the world. And this is really the implicit idea behind the divided line. The line itself is what you might call to be the good, as we will talk about it. The segments you might call to be the measures of the structurations of things in the universe.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of grapple with how to understand it after all of these critiques of representational epistemology in philosophy have come up, and how the good might be. I mean, if the relationship is not one of correspondence, then what exactly is happening between the, you know, the intelligence and its objects?
You see, exactly like how the philosophy of mind understands, how we gain traction upon knowledge of things in the world. Not everything is about correspondence. Correspondence is the most rudimentary form of a structuring, what you might call to be non-conceptual representings. Like in our nervous system, the way that basically when something happens, it affects our neural field, and that creates a pattern in us, a pattern basically of reactivation. So this is what correspondence is. But how these correspondences can actually tell us something about the structure of the world. Because by themselves, they are just belonging to the causal order. Namely, their correspondence between our nervous systems and objects or items in the environment which affect us. Now, this correspondence needs to be caught up in a higher order structure, what you might call to be in contemporary terms, the conceptual order, where you can in fact start to structure the relation between such causal patterns and hence giving a structure to them. So this correspondence, I mean, concepts are not about correspondence. Concepts don't correspond with anything. The concept of a chair doesn't refer to an actual matter-of-factual stuff in the universe. In fact, you can't talk about a chair if you don't have a concept of a chair. Even if at the level of causal order, at the level of your nervous system and how it interacts with this stuff, you have some stuff with thus and so properties, colors and shapes. It is really that those generalities, those inferential invariances, which we call concepts, allow us to organize such correspondences and give some structure to them. And at the level of concepts, concepts do not primarily represent anything. Concepts refer to one another, and that's basically what the inferential web of concepts consists of. And it is only insofar as there is such an inferential web between different concepts that we can talk about representations, namely correspondences between such and such things. So I think, and this is typically a very contemporary. Obviously, Plato weren't thinking about this, but in fact, when you look into the divided line, this is exactly what the divided line is. The realm of the iconus, namely shadows, are the realm of correspondences, non-conceptual representations, what you might call to be stimulations of how objects affect our nervous systems. At that level, you only have sensory correspondences with things or items in the universe, which are fleeting, not even transitory, they are fleeting, they are like a flux. They have a confusion, hence what Plato's called them shadows. Then the next level is that you have true beliefs, but you can't have true beliefs about such correspondences, such shadows, unless you have the logo, segment C, namely concepts or conceptual generalities, what Plato calls analytical idealities, that's in which you can basically plug these particularities into generalities, and these generalities, namely concepts, stand in relation with other generalities, other formal objects, other indexes of logos or reason or mathematics. So this is, for him, for Plato, representation is not something that can be located in one segment versus another segment. Representation comes as the combination of all these segments. You need to have forms, you need to have mathematical structures, you need to have beliefs, and what counts as asserting a true belief about something versus something else. And also you need to have those rudimentary sensory correspondences, namely the realm of iconos, the realm of the sensory.
Yeah, I mean, well, even at the level of pistis, the opinion, I mean, I'm just not sure that the level of correspondence is excluded to the realm of the shadows. It seems like it's a problem that could extend to all levels of the line.
You see, each segment is intermediary. It is not exclusive to one segment. In fact, this is the whole idea of the divided line, that it has been written in proportions. That's why it's called analogy of the divided line. So what is exactly analogy in Greeks? Analogon. Analogon means a proportional structure that can encode the ratios of something versus other things. So each segment is not just exclusive to one segment, but it has a ratios of proportion to other segments. This is the very idea of analogy. And analogy, what is exactly analogy? Analogy means basically as I mentioned, a sufficiently structured or sufficiently encoded structure according to some measure that can capture the differences, but also the relations, namely syntheses, between different things as they stand. So at the level of pistis, which is the true opinion, second segment, you essentially have what you might call to be, in a Kantian sense, intuitions, or the intuiteds, rudimentary invariances that are afforded both by sensory input, the first segment, and also the categorical structures belonging to the third segment, the segment where you have basically analytical idealities. So let's start with this. Let's start, now that we already talked about, how the structure of the divided line. Let's start with basically what is exactly the divided line. So there is this part of the Republic of Book 6, Section 509D 6 to 8. Take a line divided into two unequal sections and cut each section again in the same ratio. This way of segmenting a line creates a diagram that from left to right, you have a small segment, the smallest segment. Then you have a bigger segment, second segment. Then you have the third segment, which is equal to the second segment. And then you have the biggest segment, which is the fourth segment. So this diagram, Plato uses to, employs it as not a diagram just about epistemology or how things in the world can be understood and what is the relation between them. He gives, in fact, other than epistemological, ontological, and axiological interpretation of the divided line. As I mentioned, the diagram of the divided line encapsulates all of the ideas in Plato's work. The ideas about values and disvalues, namely axiology. The ideas about ontology, the nature of what is, and epistemology, how we gain traction, how we have knowledge of the world. When he says, take a line, divide it into unequal sections, and cut each section again in the same ratio, the Greek word for this is aton logon. Aton logon. So, and it comes back to the idea that what is exactly an analogy? Ana means upward, or basically some sort of bootstrapping. That you, from basic level, you start to construct higher levels, or from higher levels, you can create the smaller levels. So you can go in either direction. But the relation between the upper levels and higher levels, even though it's transitive, is asymmetrical. And logon is the proper method of dialectics, separation and integration. So analogy in Greek, particularly for Plato, is really a principle that captures the procedure of dialectics, separation and integration, according to measures, so as to create structures sufficient for the intelligibility of things, but also of values and disvalues, and also the intelligibility of mixed lives. So the purpose of dialectics, which we will talk about dialectics when we talk about the sophist and Theaetetus in next sessions, very briefly, the idea of dialectics is a procedure that should allow us to craft intelligibilities. And the nature of these intelligibilities is not limited to epistemological intelligibilities or ontological intelligibilities, but also include intelligibilities of values and disvalues, but also practical intelligibilities. How to craft a good life, a mixed life that can correspond adequately with other intelligibilities, namely intelligibility of the universe, intelligibility of ourselves, intelligibility of values and disvalues, so on and so forth. So what I wanted to say is that the divided line can be interpreted differently according to the framework in which you try to anchor it: epistemological, ontological, practical, and axiological. And in fact, as other works of Plato, later works of Plato, try to elaborate or unpack the condensed material presented in this diagram, it seems that the ultimate point of Plato is that you can't have just, 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 you epistemological intelligibilities. In order to have epistemological intelligibility, you should have also a good life, practical intelligibility. In order to do that, you need to have ontological intelligibility, and so on and so forth. So these are all interdependent. The order of intelligibilities, an order upon which intelligence acts, is interdependent. It's a web. So before moving forward, any question about this idea of analogy? What analogy, not in the sense that we are talking about, analogy in terms of a structuration. This is what analogy is in Greek. Proportions, structural ratios, or basically measured approaches that allow us to structure things. And by virtue of structuring things, whether they are actual things in nature, or whether they are values or disvalues, or whether they are practices, we can confer intelligibility upon them. So this is the relation between a structuring, analogon, using different measures and ratios, and intelligibility. And from a contemporary standpoint, this structuring is essentially the function of intelligence, the function of mind. There is no structure in the universe. There is no inherent structure in anything, in practices or values, these values. What gives a structure to things, and hence conferring intelligibility upon them, is the mind itself, is the intelligence itself. And hence the idealism of Plato. An idealism without which you fall back on pre-Socratic philosophy, or from a contemporary terms, you fall back on what Sellars calls the myth of the given. That as if there is a structure there in the universe, that by virtue of simple affecting us via our senses, it provides our mind with its own structures, hence becomes spontaneously or immanently intelligible to us. In Sellars' example, like basically a seal being the universe, that imposes its structure upon a melting block of wax. This melting block of wax is our mind. This is what Sellars calls the myth of the given, which is an ideology. It's a dogmatic ideology, because there is no such a thing as the given, a given structure. There is no inherent intelligibility in the universe to which mind has access in advance, or it can spontaneously access. So, and this is, as I mentioned, is one of the main ideas behind the structuration, segmentation, and also combination of these different sections or levels in the divided line. The first segment, sensory information. The second segment, intuitive opinions, which can be adjudicated, or judged. And the third section, mathematical abstractions or concepts or categories. And then the fourth one, forms par excellence, what you might call to be, at least in the epistemological interpretation of divided line, unrestricted universes of discourse.
when you said dialectics is a procedure that should allow us to craft intelligibilities, not just epistemology, but ontological as well.
But also practical.
Yeah.
And axiological, yes.
Can you expound on what you mean by dialectics allowing us to craft ontological intelligibilities, but that not being epistemological?
Well, this is so basically epistemological intelligibilities, if we are talking about simple epistemology, epistemological intelligibilities answers the question of not what things are in precise sense, but it talks about what we ought to do, what sorts of practical know-hows we should know in order for us, in fact, to be able to have beliefs about thus and so things, about things in the universe. So epistemology is different from philosophy of knowledge. Epistemology answers the question of the know-hows, of actually forming claims about things, regardless of whether these claims are true or not. Whereas philosophy of knowledge, which is the intermediary between epistemological know-hows and ontological intelligibilities, is closer to the ontology. It belongs to the ontological realm, in which you can actually talk about things as they stand, in the universe. So this idea of epistemology is very different from philosophy of knowledge, which belongs to the domain of ontology. Epistemology talks about the know-hows of how we can, in fact, say something, whether false or true, to assert something, come up with a claim about something else. That's basically the epistemological dimension.
Thanks. That helps clarify things.
Can I just ask? I'm just wondering how this this analogy or idea of analogy or whatever we can what we're talking about right now, how does this not imply the necessity of an unconditional pragmatism and therefore theodicy, and thus back to a sophism or sophistry?
Can you elaborate this by what you mean by unconditional pragmatism?
Like the good, does the good in itself not imply an unconditional pragmatism as its form of manifesting itself in relation to vocation or free choice in the personal development of attaining
you see, the good has a will, has a practical will, or some transcendental will of itself. But will is different from willker or free choice. Free choice is something that's what you might call to be, from a Kantian perspective, free choice is simply about a non-existent or relative spontaneity or autonomy that only from the perspective of subject appears to be an unconditional autonomy. This is free choice. Free choice is in fact non-existent. In fact, Kant even would say that free choice is just an illusion. It's something that is only within what you might call to be the pragmatism of subjective perspective. So,
right.
But the good itself is simply a principle of structuration. a principle of a structuration, a principle through which intelligibilities can be articulated, can be crafted and articulated, and through this articulation, intelligence can evolve. Intelligence can evolve.
So in itself, it's an inaccessible abstraction.
Yes, it is simply a principle. Yes, it is simply what you might call to be a function, an abstract function. Yes.
And provides the possibility for complexification and optimization of
variation, complexification, canalization. Yes, yes. I mean, it's basically the good can be understood as very what you might call to be new lexicon, as a transcendental function, as an abstract function.
So it doesn't necessitate like a primacy to theodicy.
No. Absolutely not. It's when you reify this abstraction into a thing, hypostasize it, as Neoplatonists do, then it becomes those kind of more uglier Platonic ramifications.
Okay, I didn't entirely get that.
You see, reification is this process of that you treat an abstraction as a thing.
Okay.
And this process, which is called hypostasization, creates categorical mistakes.
Right. I mean, because everything's insufficient inherently, ultimately.
A good example of someone who, is both very sophisticated and also makes a huge mistake in reading of Plato and precisely hypostasize the function of the good into a thing, is Proclus, one of the main philosophers of Neoplatonism. And basically that really sets in motion in medieval era a peculiarly Christian theological reading of Plato, which, to which basically we are all acquainted with. And so many people still read Plato simply by way of this, Christian take on Plato. Should we have a small break and then come back and start?
Sure, say 5 minutes or?
Sure.
Okay. I was just saying in the sidebar, it's really hard for me to even read it and not think about it in terms of this correspondence to truth type of epistemology, and I mean especially with the allegory of the cave. I think
you see, truth for Plato, and this is also, I wanted to continue my response to Oliver. As I mentioned, the very fact that there is truth, there is knowledge, that there is beauty, is because there is good. Good understood as the principle of intelligence, as a transcendental function. Now, truth for Plato is not canonical truth. In Republic, it is. In his later works, as I mentioned, forms, including truth, become taikona, categories, which means that truth is no longer unique, canonical. It's something, it's not a matter of completeness. Truth is a matter of verifiability. Simply, when there is the good, and the good basically makes everything, every endeavor in the universe, every endeavor for a mind, always incomplete. Knowledge is always incomplete. Our knowledge of the world is incomplete. Our disvalues and values incomplete. But the good allows us to simply verify them and expand the horizon of these values, disvalues, knowledge, practices, so on and so forth. So I think we will come back when, particularly when we talk about Meno and the sophists, that what exactly Plato means by truth. Truth has different levels, at the level of assertability, at the level of basically true beliefs about the nature of things, at the level of mathematical ideality, so on and so forth. Well, what I wanted to say is that insofar as the principle of the good makes every endeavor incomplete, it renders our knowledge incomplete, it renders our practices incomplete, values and disvalues incomplete. This has a very significant social ramification. Badiou, I think, is absolutely correct, even though that might appear to be a feat of exaggeration, to call Badiou the first communist. Why is that? Because if
you mean
there
to call,
is,
you mean
sorry?
to call, you meant to call Plato, not call Plato the first communist, not Badiou the first communist.
Oh yeah, sorry, Plato the first communist. Yes, sorry. Why is that? It's precisely because if there is a transcendental function, a principle that renders every achieved or totality, every system that appears to be the totality of things incomplete, dissolves them. That's exactly what communism is, according to Marx and Engels. A real movement that rises above the totalities of the present. This real movement is exactly what the transcendental function is for Plato, that basically he in the Statesman, he basically elaborates this function in terms of its social ramification. That's this principle allows us, the principle of intelligence, the principle of the good, allows us to move beyond any achieved or purportedly complete totality. Whether this is a totality of our practices, whether it's the totality of our knowledge, or whether it is the totality of the statecraft, namely politics.
The way, can I just say, the way I'm understanding this is that it doesn't necessarily imply a relativism.
No.
And at the same time, it makes possible, or the good is precisely that which makes possible desert warfare.
The good is that which brings about the space of the possible. That even if you think you have achieved a totality, whether this is your knowledge of an object, whether it is the system of your practices, whether it is the system of axiological values and disvalues of ethics, there is still something beyond it. And this is basically, I equated the principle of the good with transcendental will in Kantian sense, rather than Wilker, which is free choice. Because transcendental will is exactly like that too. Transcendental will is something that is what you might call to be some sort of drive for you to use the same principle in order to break any achieved totality, any form of basically established order.
Or like the reduction of things to ends in themselves.
Yes. In fact, this is, again, we come back to this in Philebus and Timaeus. That's why he calls this production, and he associates this form of production with what he calls the demiurgic principle. A demiurge is someone who crafts, and in fact compares the soul, the mind, with a craftsman. A craftsman is someone who is always in productions, and he never abides by what is given in material ingredients of his craft, nor with the instructions of the recipes of how to craft something. Every craft becomes basis for something else.
Right. So, like, it's sort of like the creation of, I don't know, I'm trying to understand this, a personal metamorphosis based on the garnering of new forms of techne.
Techne practices, yes.
From the practice itself.
Yes. Yes, depending if you are
acquisition of eudaimonia.
Yes, and you see, there's a reason that Plato was so infatuated with Socrates, because this is the principle of self-cultivation. If you interpret it at a personal level, self-cultivation, which is one of the main ideas associated with eudaimonia, happiness,
like the creation of a routine in one's life to
not essentially routines, what you might call to be disciplines or assesses. Assesses meaning not in the Christian sense of ascetic life, but in terms of forming new exercises.
Yeah. Right. So right. I mean, but this is This is right. This is the good life. This is I've read a lot of Pierre Hadot, and
Yes,
exactly what he focuses on.
yes, yes,
The
absolutely, yes.
the and Elenchus and also and I also and Nehamos. I was really into Nehamos a while ago,
Uh-huh.
10 years ago, on the art of living.
Yes. There
Foucault.
is another fantastic book that I highly suggest is by John Sellars. Exactly the title, The Art of Living. It's a very, very good book. And another one, the famous last lecture of Michel Foucault, which he talks about Socrates. It's also a very, very good one. And basically, they are all covering the same principle. But you see, the way that they focus on the idea of self-cultivation as this idea of a form of production, that's once you commit to it, once you let it shine in Socratic sense through your soul or your mind, you harness the power of going beyond any established order of things, any achieved totality, which at the end is an illusion.
So you build your own foundation from which your activity provides the means to the building of the house. So the house needs a foundation put in first, and that's something that needs to always be there in a certain way.
Yes, and this is one of the, of course, the main theme of the allegory of the cave. People think that Plato is like, treats sun as a metaphor of purity, the very Nietzschean idea. But this is not really the case. Plato actually his main positive emphasis is not really on the sun, but on the exploration of the cave. Exploration of the cave. A fantastic work written on this idea that how to read the allegory of the cave as an expression of basically certain principles or certain practices through which you can, in fact, attain a good life, or basically access the order of intelligibility of things, practices, values, and disvalues, is John Findlay, a book called the Discipline of the Cave.
But then aren't we just talking about Patochka, Dumézil, Klatra, and Girard, René Girard, the secrets, hidden traditions of religion, the sacred, and culture.
Yes, but Plato doesn't really. You see, Plato appears at the first sight as a mystic, but Plato simply does not believe in any of these things. For Plato, exploration of the cave requires measures, and these measures are set by analytical idealities.
Okay.
In a very, very contemporary sense, that you need to have logic, you need to have concepts, you need to have mathematics in order to explore the cave. You can't have mystical measures. You cannot rely on such things. The idea of measure in Plato is extremely important, and that he borrows from Parmenides.
So it's not just an understanding or knowledge of culture, access to cultural secrets, but moreover like an ancient established order that's handed down a manner of acting to which we develop a correspondence or whatnot.
Not in the traditional sense, but yes, it's a matter of practical know-hows. Practical know-hows of, for example, in the second segment, is a practical know-hows of how to make, in fact, an opinion about something, whether that opinion can be said to be true or false. It's a matter of know-hows of how to use concepts or logoi or reasons. It's a matter of know-hows of how to use forms.
So it's yeah, it's a textual imposition in the end. It's a textual imposition as opposed to the pure act. So I mean, what confuses me is the total and infinite indeterminacy can show itself to be possible or true and then but then at the same time eudaimonia is something created within networks and ages and societies as opposed to I mean, can you live a good life if you never leave your room but always order delivery? I mean, these are the questions that I guess I don't know if that's even interesting.
Well, if Plato had to answer this, or Socrates had to answer this, he would say first yes, but then ultimately no.
Ultimately, no, right? I mean, but then it's Aristotle. This is Aristotle saying the contemplative life supersedes the political life, but then on the other hand, the political life is necessary for.
Yes, as I mentioned, you see there are different orders of intelligibility. The intelligibility of practices, social practices, the intelligibility of things, and these order of intelligibilities, and which dialectic is supposed to separate and integrate, to combine ever more higher orders of intelligibilities, allows us to simply see how they are dependent upon one another. And basically this order, the realization of this order of interdependency between different orders of intelligibilities is necessary and sufficient, according to Plato, for having a good life.
I mean, but this is all reduced to access to information in our
Not you see, intelligibilities are not information. Intelligibilities, as I mentioned, what is exactly intelligibility? Intelligibility is something that has been structured so as allowing an agent to be able to adequately understand or act on something. Hence, again, comes back to this idea of truth. Truth that are not just theoretical, but also practical.
So it's like a YouTube video that tells you how to cook an eggplant parmesan, for instance. There's an intelligibility to it, and according to that intelligibility, you yourself can replicate that cooking of the eggplant parmesan, even though you can add your own way of doing it, and it's not going to turn out exactly like the person in the YouTube video.
But you might take it another level, this metaphor, saying that this is, according to Plato, is he it's just an instrumentality. It is an intelligible instrumentality. But beyond the level of intelligible instrumentalities, there are also other intelligibilities. Intelligibility of the purpose of doing this, which is, again, connected to the intelligibility of how I can relate it to other intelligibilities. Can I serve this to other people? Can I do this? Again, intelligibilities of these material ingredients. I can, in fact, do this better, or in fact, I can abandon this way of doing this by simply doing this scientifically, rather than just using, you know, some sort of culinary instruction. So there are these unfolding ramifications of intelligibility.
Absolutely. This answers my question perfectly. So the intelligibilities are not reducible to pragmatic.
No instrumentalities. No, instrumentalities belong to the order of intelligibilities.
Sorry?
Intelligibilities belong to the order. They are just simply a set, a very restricted set of intelligibilities.
Okay.
Not everything is reducible to instrumentalities.
Okay.
And this is the main point that Plato makes in Philebus. As I said, his most mature work.
But then does this not imply that there's some sort of predominance or primacy to the intelligibility of sacrifice?
I don't know how that works.
I mean, like a non-instrumental intelligibility, something like an artwork, like a painting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, okay, so when someone looks to purchase a painting, what is it in that painting that appeals to them?
Yes, you see, that's what I said, that there are also different orders of intelligibilities according to Plato. Not everything is the intelligibility of practices or practical intelligibilities, to which the order of intelligibility instrumentalities belong. There are also axiological intelligibilities according to Plato. Values and disvalues, and aesthetics. Aesthetics belongs to the order of axiological intelligibilities.
Right, the forms of virtues.
Yes.
And I guess that in a way provides some sort of foundation for communication,
Mm-hmm.
according to a level of comprehension in which cultures and societies can relate, primarily according to the mutual consensus over the necessity of maintaining a particular value or interpretation of what could be called a value.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the things that's
so it's a mutualism, really. That
yes.
Good.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that if anyone else has a question, they can step in too.
Thank you for clarifying that for me.
Absolutely.
I just had one really brief question. Did you say that the good life is a mixed life?
A micton, yes, what Plato calls a micton, yes, mixed life. And this idea of mixture, as I mentioned, is essentially Plato's solution to pre-Socratic philosophies. So Heracliteans are the ones who move with multiplicities, fluxes, change. You know, other philosophers, Eleatics, go with unities, the ones. There are other philosophers who interpret these principles of apeiron, the infinite, and peros, limits, multiplicities, on an axiological level. Like, for example, Epicureans who are after this read pre-Socratics and they use the idea of multiplicity as a base of how to live the best life. And at the level of multiplicity, what you essentially have are disconnected activities, which you can, again, bring back to the idea of pleasures, sensory stimulations. Or, for example, the Stoics think about, cynics believe in a form of a rational order of pleasures, namely unities. So Plato essentially wants to understand a life, a good life, but also how to craft and in fact determine what a good life consists in by way of the process of mixturing, mikton. And as I said, the principle we're talking about next sessions, the principle responsible for producing a good mixture, a good mikton, is dialectics, in the Platonic sense of dialectics, separation and integration, limiting and delimiting of the relation between things, values and practices according to their own measures.
I think this problem of mixture helps answer Theodore's continued insubordination with regards to conceptual thinking, because of it's not about correspondence, because I mean the transcendentals that are held within the soul aren't connected specifically to any concrete objects until the confrontation with the concrete multiplicity of objects, and then the transcendentals then act as inferential coordinates in order to render intelligible that concrete multiplicity.
Another thing that's we have kind of behind about our even starting the analogy of divide line, but doesn't matter. We can still have some makeup sessions at the end. But I want to talk about this idea that truth in Plato. We will talk about this. But as I mentioned, truth in Republic is what you might call to be a very Platonic, in a very with capital T truth. But as he moves forward, particularly starting from Theaetetus, which is the transitional work between mid-period and late period, truth, as I mentioned, becomes something called, in contemporary sense, we might call it a presumptive or promising truth, a truth candidate, a matter of incompleteness, a matter of inquiry. So you start, we talked about this in the previous course. In a traditional sense, truth, at least in Greeks, comes in the sense of the given. That what axioms are, data, like Euclid's elements. Truth comes as axioms. Something that you have them and then you build a structure on top of them, which is hierarchical. The foundations are the given truth, the truth givens, or data, or axioms. But you have also a different conception of truth, the truth candidates. According to some criterion of conceptual plausibility, according to some measures, you see some claims as truth candidates. They have the highest plausibility according to current resources. Then you create a system of these truth candidates, and how they cohere with one another allow you to navigate from the outer rims rather than from the bottom upward of the axiomatic method. You create these basically truth givens, and then you slowly cohere them. And through this process of coherence, which is inferential articulation of truths, you sometimes discard some of these truth candidates and replace them with more plausible ones. And then that's basically your process of converging on truth, which, as I mentioned, for Plato, particularly in his later work, truth is rendered incomplete by the principle of the good. There is never a totality of truth. Truth is a form that allows you, in fact, to come up with measures of how to determine the plausibility of things and how they cohere with one another. But as such, in itself, is never complete.
I'd be curious to hear you go on and talk about the cave as well.
Sure. Any question? Any Hunter? Okay, if we don't have any question, let's so we saw how the diagram looks like, consisting of 4 segments. The first, each of these segments represent a level of what you might call to be the intelligible order, or how intelligence functions. The first level, which is icosia, or icono, whose objects are iconos, images, or shadows, is properly speaking is the domain of sensory materials. Sensory materials always come in a flux. They are essentially confused. So these are, in the allegory of cave, are shadows on the wall. They are fleeting, exactly like shadows. Sensory stimulations, sensory flux is fleeting. It does not have any stability.
I was thinking earlier that you might actually be able to identify the epistemological, axiological, and ontological components in the divided line based upon the way that basically the 4th grounding principle ends up sort of being reformative of another aspect. And I was thinking that the epistemological would be the 4th, maybe on the 2nd, and then like because it's changing your true opinion, and like axiological would be like the 4th to the 1st, because it's being reformative of the world, so it's practical.
Yes.
And then, so there's an interest. So it's like depending. The axiological, ontological, and epistemological are different ways that the different vectors of movement between the divided line.
Yes, no, that is completely true. Yes. So the first level is the level of the sensory fluxes, which is always confused. Hence, the metaphor of shadows, fleeting. But Plato wants to say that even at this level, we have the reality of, even the reality of shadows, the rudimentary reality of shadows, which is an illusion, of course, is posited by a further, from a further level, from segment 2. How does this possible? Because you can't even have, according to this metaphor of this analogy, you can't even have an awareness, non-conceptual awareness, or rudimentary awareness of sensory stimulation if you could not differentiate, if your nervous system, you could not differentiate these stimulations from one another. at the most basic level, which Plato calls it in terms of more or less intensities. So the very fact that you in fact have a recognition, a non-conceptual recognition of stimulations, is because intelligence has the capacity to organize sensory materials, being thus and so affected in terms of densities, more or less. More or less is the most rudimentary or most basic way by which you can structure the world. Basically, all what you might call organisms have that. Any organism has a form of differentiation of stimulating signals. The jargon for this in philosophy of mind and in philosophy is called the acoulithic phase. A-K-O-U-L-I-T-H-I-C, I think. So acoulithic phase is precisely the idea that even at this level of confused flux, fleeting shadows, they are essentially a form of organization. An organization that is not inherent to the flux of sensory of sensory stimulations, but something that belongs to the intelligence. And you can differentiate similar shadows from less similar shadows. You can spatiotemporally locate them. You can see them in terms of intensity of them versus less intense, more or less, which this is particular conversation that later comes at the end of Republic, where Socrates talks about the iconos in terms of more or less differentiation, more or less. Even at this level, you have something of the mind rather than of reality as such. So this is, as I mentioned, why is that Plato is idealist? Not in a naive sense, but precisely because he thinks that if there is no mind, there is no reality. Because the nature of the organization or the structure not given in the sensory material is the intelligence has the capacity to differentiate rudimentary, in the most basic level, sensory stimulations, icons or shadows or fleetings. So,
this is so you'll have to forgive my sort of stunned silence because I just haven't heard of Plato being read like this before. But
the great, it's actually, as I mentioned, Plato, the reading of Plato is unfortunately, for the most part, until 20th century, when actually people, scholars, mostly women actually, started to really dig into Plato and see what's actually going on without the preconceived interpretation borrowed from, you know, Neoplatonists. One of the best books, probably in my opinion, the best commentary ever written on Plato, by one of the most famous, you know, Platonic scholars, who tries to, you know, reconcile the Tübingen school interpretation, the unwritten doctrines, and the actual canon of the dialogues, is Rosemary Desjardins. But actually, this interpretation of the divided line has been given not just by her, it has been given by Findlay, it has given by Giovanni Reale, it has given by Ona Harari. It's actually quite a very, you know, when you read the dialogues, this is exactly how it is. And as I mentioned, it is the only part, the only ever you know, section in any of Plato's dialogues that all of these are actually combined together, compacted together, is the analogy of the divided line. And that's why we chose this, precisely because analogy of the divided line exactly talks about shadows in terms of flux, fleetings, or flux of senses.
I mean, I lost you for a second there, but are you saying in some sense that there's a finite but potentially infinite quantity of unsuspectable reactions to every one of our choices and behaviors in the sense in which we wouldn't be able to know but could always imagine that which results from our actions, like as if these more or lesses are indicative of a reason that is maintained as a sort of clinomen. I mean, I hate talking about this stuff, but are you implying in the sense that Plato's a precursor to Lucretius, perhaps?
Not really, no. I think, no, I don't see, you know, might be, might be a form of comparison, but I genuinely don't think so. I think this idea of, yes, Plato might say that there might be like you know, infinite possible reactions, but these infinite possible reactions, they are crafted according to some measures. They are not haphazard. They are only haphazard at the level of the first segment, at the level of sensory stimulations. Later on, they have intrinsic structure, precisely because they have to abide by some norms, analytical ideologies, and idols. But even if they have to abide by these norms, there are possibilities afforded by them. And these possibilities, according to Plato, are truly infinite. And that's the realm of forms, the realm of idols. That you can, in fact, see particularities in different shade. So
there's a justifiable causality.
Yes, it's a matter of justification. Justification is important. This is really comes back again to the idea of truth in Plato.
A sort of, right. So, but then, right. A legitimacy is surmised or imposed upon the reaction.
Yes, it's the idea of legitimacy, and this legitimacy again can be interpreted on different levels, whether it's epistemological, whether it is the knowledge of ontology, whether it's axiological.
I mean, but this would imply that complexity and comprehensibility, I mean, on a level of lucidity that also contains an obscurantism, would be the sort of narrative or textual sort of thrust of the eudaimonic project. Did that make any sense?
I need to think about it. But one of the things I will think about it, and next session I will come up with some sort of answer. But one of the things is important. As I mentioned, for Plato, the emphasis is not really on eudaimonia. Yeah, for Stoics, for Cynics, it is eudaimonia, but not for Plato. Plato's doesn't really, as I mentioned, this eudaimonia comes off as the main objective of Plato in Republic. But as I mentioned, Plato always, as he matured, he thought that Republic is one of his weakest work, in fact. And he started to vastly revise this idea that eudaimonia is the center of his project. It's the good, and the good is different from a good life. The good is a principle that, in fact, brings about the possibility of the good life. But I will think about your question, and I genuinely need to think about it.
So the good is something he's sort of Plato is always chasing after.
Yes.
Behind
Yes.
bushes. I mean, even to this.
He doesn't chase it. He actually, he what you might call to be, he thinks that this is a principle, and this is the principle by which, in fact, you can think about anything, by which you can, in fact, have a practice to begin with. And this is basically, the divided line is precisely this, the cognitive order. A cognitive order that enables us to talk about things, but also to act in different ways.
This is beautiful. It really is beautiful.
So, one of the things also I forgot to mention at the beginning of the sessions before moving forward, it would be really, really useful if you are reading Plato, always starting from the later works and read the middle period, the most famous ones, in light of the later works, because many of these connections that appear, or you have, when you read Republic, you always treat it with preconceived ideas of interpretations that are common in Platonic studies. But reading those concepts, for example, particularly the divided line and the ikasia and ikonos, pistis, so on and so forth, they have a different interpretation, a very more nuanced interpretation in later works. Particularly, as I mentioned, Philebus. So, for example, ikasia, the realm of images, in Philebus is presented as a phase in which, from an originally sensory continuum of more or lessness, we first consciously separate out elementary sense perceptions. The imaging action of ikasia would be seen to constitute our initial cognitive taking. But is there any evidence that Plato or the Platonic Socrates ever held such a view? Now, I think once one approaches, these two texts, Republic and Philebus, particularly with the emphasis on the analogy of the divided line, Plato talks about a material element inherent in the primeval nature and infected with great order. This is a quote from a statesman where there is a very, very brief mention of ikasia. So, until intelligence, so, and then this part of the statesman, which is again a very late work, throughout this dialogue, when they address the nature of ikasia, the participants of the dialogue talk about that the disorder of things cannot be ordered until intelligence, nous, begins to introduce logon, a structure, to it. Now, they say also at the same time that this sensory structure, this ikasia, is alogos, irrational, ametros, by itself, alogos and ametros, unmeasured and unstructured, and anos, mindless, irrational.
Is it similar to the relationship between eisesis and ethos?
Can you elaborate on this?
Like in the sense in which Rancière talks about aesthetics as sort of and the image, like from like in Bergson's Matter and Memory, the image as it becomes the force behind the communicative proposition or statement.
Not the force, but you might call it as the raw material of it.
Something
as a raw material, and that's exactly what the divided line shows. That it's a raw material for the second segment. A raw material, but the raw material, you see, this is what I say, that this entire idea of the divided line comes back to the idea of craft. And in Timaeus, in Philebus, in the Statesman, but also in Republic, there is this idea of the metaphor of a craftsman. The idea that a craftsman always uses some raw material in its craft to make something, an intelligibility, right? Something rational, something imbued with logos.
But how raw material cannot itself be language and only language ultimately?
But this is the whole thing, that the raw materials by themselves do not have the instruction of the craft. So in order for you to craft, and this is the idea of that he puts in Timaeus, in order for you to craft an intelligibility, you not only need raw materials, namely iconos or images or sensory material, but also you need to have proportions, structures, analogon. You need to have ratios, namely logoses. You need to have basically forms to put them together. So this is the idea of, the scholars call it, the idea of intelligibility essentially needs to be understood as a recipe. A recipe, just exactly like you're making a cake, not only have raw materials, which might be products of something else, but also it has instructions, it has ratios and proportions, it has instrumentalities, and none of them by themselves are sufficient to make a craft. Only in conjunction with one another that they make something intelligible. And the divided line essentially is this. Essentially, as I mentioned, is a form of classification of levels of cognition required for us to be capable of making something intelligible, whether that intelligibility pertains to the world or practices or values or disvalues. So back to an analogy of the divided line. So reading Republic in the light of later works, we see that icosia, iconos, images, are introduced in different dialogues as essentially rudimentary organization, rudimentary structures, metrons, and logons that have been introduced to a primeval nature that is essentially disordered. Essentially disordered. So the function, even at the function of the mind, nous, is to basically structure, hence render intelligible, this nature. And the first level with which this process begins is the most rudimentary form of a structuration, which in Republic, Plato talks about the shadows in terms of the continuum of high and low intensity of shadows. In A Statesman, he talks about them in terms of more or less. In Timaeus, he talks about them in terms of intensities. That even at this level, we have a minimum form of differentiation and separation that can inject a structure, an order, into the most primeval fluxes of nature, sensory materials. The second, as I said, I highly recommend, if you can obtain that book by Rosemary Desjardins. It's called Plato and the Good. Unfortunately, it's a bit expensive, but it is absolutely a phenomenal book. And
there is a PDF of it.
It's in the document.
Oh, did I put it? Okay, excellent. So this is the first one. The first segment is the segment which we called images, fleetings, or fluxes in a pre-Socratic sense, which Plato thinks that at the first level, in ratios and proportions with regard to other segments in the line, you have something called a minimal organization, a minimal structure. But this minimal structure is afforded by other segments of the line. At the second level, you have pistes. What are pistes? They are what you might call them conjectures or opinions or beliefs. What is really the characteristics of beliefs? The characteristics of beliefs means that you should have some criterion as to, in fact, assert a claim, assert a conjecture, even though that claim might be at the end false. So the idea of truth is exactly where it starts from, the second segment. Precisely because truth, not as whether a claim or a belief or an opinion is true or false, but in fact there should be a form of truth or a truth procedure required for us to make a claim about anything in the world. Because making a claim in the world doesn't come, is not something God-given, doesn't come by itself. So this is exactly where what you might call to be rudimentary knowledge starts from this segment. It is not knowledge yet, but you see that embryonically this idea of truth emerges in Plato from this segment. Now, just as, so it's from an epistemological reading of a divided line, whereas the first segment pertained to sensory materials, the second segment belongs to beliefs about items in the world, objects. I just said objects, but objects, according to Plato, or what you might call them particularities, particular items, is something that can only be afforded by the third segment. You see, every segment is afforded by next segment. The first one, the structure of the second, then the material, the stuff that you can do in the second segment, which is the realm of true opinions about things in nature, is required by unities. You can't, in fact, talk about, for example, a chair. A chair at the level of the first segment comes as fleeting shadows, more or less distinctions. Hotter, colder, brighter, so on and so forth. In order for you to organize this into a particularity of which you can have an opinion, whether false or true, you need to have a unity. This is what you might call it an object, a particularity. These are in the cave, these are exactly those figurines or things that are behind the fire and cast shadows. From
the thing I say, the thing that strikes me is that the difference between a lounge chair, like a lazy boy, or a massage chair, or an Eames chair, and an electric chair, are so diverse, but still are classified under the taxonomy
of chair, yes.
category of chair, that they don't reach a level whereby a complexity of description could be called indeterminate. Nevertheless,
yes. And as I said, I mean, if you were going to give a very, very contemporary, nothing to do with Plato whatsoever, but nevertheless I think very relevant, is that this nature of indeterminacy is in fact required for this whole idea of intelligibility. Semantic wholeness, semantic holism, comes hand in hand with epistemic holism. And in epistemic holism, you require further and further inquiry as to determine the relations between particularities. And semantic holism is about those concepts, taxonomies, classifications, so on and so forth, and the inferential relations between those classifications. So these are always, you know, conjoined.
But there's an abyss of essence between the electric chair and the lazy boy.
Well, yes, and that's why there is also an abyss of intelligibilities. You can go deeper and deeper, and this is ultimately what makes Plato a philosophy of the abyss. Unlike Nietzsche, who thought that Plato is always works on the ground. No, actually, Plato set a principle that it takes you further and further into articulation of these relations.
I mean, this is basically the underlying sort of the underlying hermeneutic stance of recours, that there's always a +1, like n+1. There's always an exception or something that could be deviated so as to create a further interpretation. Kuhn and Popper come to mind. Falsifiability and the structure of scientific revolution.
Yes, but I think Kuhn's interpretation of Plato is quite very classic, and I don't think that it's just about falsifiability. It's really this idea of truth candidacy, the idea that truth is considered as a procedure, as a principle that allows you to verify things, allows you to articulate, inferentially articulate things. It's not something that is given to you. Once you have truth candidates in terms of conceptual plausibilities, then you are capable of navigating these diverse relations. And not all relations come to falsifiability or verifications. Sometimes they are hypotheticals. Sometimes they are counterfactual. Sometimes they are about falsity and verification. Sometimes they are not. This is a whole web of these kinds of relations. And that's, I think, one of the best representations of this in terms of science is very much closer to this idea of Platonic unfolding of the order of intelligibilities is German philosopher of science Wolfgang Stegmuller.
Sorry, will you say that again? Wolfgang?
Stegmuller, Stegmllur.
Stegmuller, okay.
Stegmuller. So, at the level, as I mentioned, in order for us to, in fact, move from its first level to the second level, we require something more.
I'm thinking pistis as conviction that would presumably require some sort of personal argument, but in today's day doesn't actually require any sort of argument. You could just come straight to the conclusion, and garnering assurances such as likes on Facebook or retweets on Twitter would be the way of gaining support for whatever conclusion or belief you would have. So having an actual argument to back it up is not as important as garnering assurance from a multitude.
Interesting.
But then again, I'm not sure whether that does that not broach on sort of like a totalitarianism and the necessity of an authoritarianism.
I tried to talk about some of these. Yes, I think Plato, I mean, this is the whole idea that Plato uses a very specific word in Philebus when he comes back to analogy of the divided line, also in Republic. It means to leap. And they talk about risk of making a leap. Intelligence is what makes a leap. Every segment requires a level, consists of levels. The divided line consists of segments, and segments can be considered as levels. Making leap from one segment to another segment, one level to another, the risks increases. What is at stake becomes, higher and higher. And you make a wrong move as you go upward at the level of levels, things can basically, result in tragedies. And this is exactly what the conversation that Socrates with Glaucon has in Republic. That this is a risky business. The order of thinking is a risky business. The order of practice, according to these principles, is a risky business. Intelligence is a risky thing.
Yeah, right. And that's at the same time. It's always like the miracle of the political is the failure of the politician, is his defacement and removal from the political scene.
Well, I don't want to divert too much, but very briefly before getting back, and don't have that much time. Very, very brief thing. Plato and Socrates were extremely anti-democratic. They did not believe in democracy, in the sense that they think that democracy, I mean, you need to understand the social condition of Greece during their time. The democracy is not something that was promulgated by philosophers. It was something that was the product of sophistry. Sophists were the ones who selling democracy and the ideas about democracy, namely, particularly two things. The idea that simply we can say everyone is equal at birthright. Two, the freedom of expression. What is basically, that's the main theme in the sophist, that the sophist is the one who thinks that saying things, all sayings are equal because all sayings are true.
Of course. Otherwise it would be hypocritical.
And Plato is really shows that Plato is the person who comes with the idea of equality of all minds. But the matter of equality of all minds is a matter of concrete social elaboration rather than a presupposition. That you can simply say that, well, we are all equal, so let's start in this kind of liberal democratic atmosphere. So democracy for liberation or emancipation or equality for Plato is not something that is given at birthright. Once you take it as something given at birthright, you might end up simply going stagnant, endorsing the most tyrants of history. And that's basically the whole idea of Socrates, the Socratic trial. And again, comes back to the idea that democracy is simply a means toward ends that transcend it. Democracy is, if you take democracy as an end in itself, you essentially, the path to tyranny is inevitable, according to Plato.
I have a question that I don't want to derail because if people would like to stay longer today, we can, because we
we can actually. I think I have to go somewhere, but we can, as I mentioned, we will we put 1 or 2 sessions at the end, like additional sessions in addition to 8.
That sounds great. So the question I had is, are you seeing the model of the divided line, the image of the divided line, as being a model of an ontology of immanence too, as well as being a map of thought itself?
Yes, this ontology of immanence that you are mentioning, this is exactly what Findlay talks about when he talks about the divided line. Yes, yes. I will try to get a PDF of this. I think I have it somewhere on my hard drive, Findlay's book on Plato, where he talks about the problem of immanence in the divided line. And that's basically what he argues. But I think the idea of this cognitive map gives a more robust understanding of what Plato, what counts as immanent and as transcendental in Plato's work. So very briefly, just to so next session I will try to talk about again 2nd level, 3rd level, and the 4th level. But very briefly. So in the 1st level, we had iconos. And in Republic, Plato implies that experience is limited to the apprehension of passing shadows, projected on a wall and of fleeting echoes resounding off the wall. Their cognitive activity, the cognitive activity of the prisoners in the cave, this is exactly one of the best translations of this part that it talks about. This whole idea of seeing shadows and hearing the echoes, which can be only differentiated by less and more, represents a cognitive activity limited to, this is quote from Republic, putting names on images, labeling images, and vying with each other in so identifying these appearances, remembering their customary precedents, sequences, and consistencies, and so guessing as what is to come. Tomelon hexin. This is the very idea, if you see what is to come, to anticipate is the function of the memory. So what basically, you might say that the move from this first one, from sensory organization, from the minimal sensory organization to the second, to the second level, is something that is afforded by the function of memory, what he calls guessing at what remembering their customary precedents, sequences, and consistencies, and so guessing at what is to come, to anticipate what is to come. This is what you might call to be, in a Kantian sense, impression, reproduction, and anticipation. That without memory, without this, without having the capacity to organize these impressions, these sense impressions, into sequences with their internal consistency, you cannot have particularities. So, which back to this idea that there are so many interpretations of the cave as essentially an argument about the conditions necessary for having phenomenal appearances in the first place. Having phenomenal appearances in the first place, as said, is not a given matter. It's not something that is the structure of the universe. There needs to be some capacities, minding capacities or noetic capacities, in order, in fact, to provide such appearances which we take as given, which of course are not. Shadows appear to be given, but the very fact that they appear to be given, namely a phenomenal appearance, is because we have the capacity to structure this as a given, as an appearance, as a datum, as a shadow. Any question before?
So
And
fake
next,
news, basically.
sorry?
Fake news, basically.
Fake news.
I typed a couple other questions in the sidebar that is the expansion and self-making of thought a type of, I'm going to omit hegemonic, but I did say hegemonic organization. It almost sounds like the power of thought is actually more akin to force. And then I said,
you know that the Stoics are. Plato probably wouldn't answer this, but from our perspective, yes. And Stoics, in fact, go on and call it hegemonikon. Hegemonikon is the cognitive power, is the mind.
right.
Mind essentially, and mind for Plato is essentially a structuring point. And the divided line is essentially, as I mentioned, shows different modules or levels of structuring you require to make the world intelligible in its expansiveness, and on different levels, whether this is the world of practices, the world of society, the world of things in nature, or values and disvalues. And yes, it comes back to the thing that I mentioned to Adam at the beginning, this whole idea of self-consciousness, this idea that thinking refers to itself, beginning with its own possibility, taking its possibility seriously, rather than the possibility of other things, has a structuring ramifications. Once the order of intelligibility comes to the picture, the order of intelligence becomes hegemonic. Because what is ultimately intelligence? Is that which acts on the intelligible adequately.
So Tantra, basically. This is Tantra.
You see, I have problem with comparing what Plato means by intelligibility with, more of a what you might call to be sage-oriented philosophies, or particularly Sino-Indian philosophies. Not that there are not philosophies, but the way that they talk about what they mean by, for example, the intelligible, again, is not really intelligible in this sense. For example, this is one of the things that when you go to read, for example, the Brahmanian or Buddhistic texts, that the picture of the universe that they give is quite actually mechanistic. Whereas Plato is an idealist. Plato does not believe in something that mind loses itself in cosmos, or intelligibility is something that is given in advance, but it's something that is excavated by the power of mind. And this power of mind is not mind, again, in that traditional sage, philosophy, sage-oriented philosophies. Mind has principles, and these principles are driven by formal resources of thinking: justification, conceptualization, classification, verification, coherences.
So it is mind that imposes order upon the disorganization of the shadows, right?
Yes, but even, as I mentioned, even at the level of the shadows, you have minimal organization. But this minimal organization, again, is not given by the great disorder of nature, the Heraclitean flux, but it's something that is imposed by mind on it at the most rudimentary level.
So it's objective.
Yes. Well, at this level, you don't have objectivity. At this level, you have what you might call to be just simple matter of factual, belonging to the causal order, matter of factual relations between how things stand to each other. For example, this is brighter than the other one. Objectivity, when it comes to the pictures, when you can actually make a claim about them. Moving to the second segment. It is when you can make a claim about something, you can assert about something that can be further challenged by other claims and against further observations, then you can say something can be said to be objective.
But the order then is sort of archaic, apodictic continuity.
I don't see, how it becomes apodictic in the sense, you see, this is the idea that the process of justification is not simply a matter of communication. It's not a matter of, for example, having access to information. So it's a process that requires some norms, what Plato calls measures, and these measures quite differ from one another. At each level, we have some measures. Level of this divide line, we have some measures. And it's only the combination of these measures and the right applications of measures that allow us to, in fact, justify something to be objective. But for something to be objective doesn't mean that it is essentially true. Objectivity should not be equated with the idea of a claim to be true. Objectivity means that it is an assertion, a claim, or a belief, or an opinion about certain state of affairs in the world through which you can launch an epistemic inquiry. You can, in fact, investigate whether it is true or not.
So this is the hidden, subversive systematization of cultures.
Yes, and in Republic, but also I think in the Statesman, Plato associates a subversive, very literally, a subversive import to the power of rationality that can, in fact, put every norm in peril. It can subvert every form of convention by virtue of its principles.
So we're now 10 minutes past. Does anyone else have any other questions? I want to make sure that everyone else has an opportunity to speak if they'd like.
I just wanted to say one more thing. So when you come out of the cave and you see the sunlight, you go back in, you try and convince the people who are looking at the shadows that they're not seeing real things. And when that doesn't work, because it doesn't, you just join the people creating the shadows. And that's just the way it works.
We will talk about, we haven't got to the allegory of cave or the third and the fourth segment. But I will talk about this. Our different interpretation of this idea of how, what it means to return to the cave. It's actually, I think, it's a quite really interesting. It's one of those moments that Plato becomes again ambiguous, very ambiguous. I will talk about this hopefully next session. But yeah, I agree that not essentially what you are saying in terms of that it's always going to end up like this, but Plato is actually quite, pessimistic about this idea, and he also the way that he presents this is ambivalent. I mean, sociopolitical is ambivalent.
So I'll try to upload a lot of the PDFs that I have of the Plato material you sent earlier.
Yes.
Onto the classroom, and
sure.
I just sent you an invite to the classroom as well.
Excellent.
And then for next week, are we going to be following up with the cave, and then just people should try and read the supplementary material on this?
No, okay. So I'm going to next session talk about a little bit about still we need to finish this idea of the divided line and how what does exactly these segments ultimately are and how they combine or join together. But yes, we can have a reading. It's a text, you can find it online. It's called Soul as Craftsman by Wilfred Sellars. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you everyone, and thank you, Reza.
Thanks everyone.
Oh, I had one brief question.
Sure.
I mean, it might like open a big can of worms, but I just was wondering if you think there would be a connection between Girard's 4 levels and this.
Girard, you mean Jean-Yves Girard?
Yeah.
Go on.
I was just wondering if you think is it homologous in any way?
I haven't thought about it.
It's a monstrous
That's
question.
one of those very esoteric relations that really
who are you asking about?
Jean-Yves Girard, the mathematician and pioneered linear logic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Pete and Reza are big fanboys of Jean-Yves Girard.
Yes, no, I need to think about this. But very quickly.
I was going to say one more thing. Something else that might seem similar. I mean, it's totally just an awful numerological comparison, but Badiou also makes sorts things into 4 levels in his Mark and Lack in the concept and form.
Well, that's exactly Plato's thing, and he's very explicit about it in his book Republic. There is actually a very, very fantastic dialogue that he creates between Socrates and Glaucon and other people with a diagram of the divided line, where Plato actually gives a very, very good interpretation of the divided line across the same lines that I was talking about.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. See you next week.
All right, sounds good. And Reza, can I stay on the hangout with you right after for a second?
Sure.